Johnny Carson was once the unrivaled giant of American television. Night after night, whether movie icons or pop sensations, everyone tuned in for Carson's wit and unruffled style. There was nobody more consistent, nobody bigger. Johnny Carson was everywhere. For 30 years, he held late-night TV in the palm of his hand, turning awkward silences into laughter, smoothing over tough interviews with a quick joke or a sly grin. But even a seasoned pro has his breaking points. Away from the spotlight, a handful of guests managed to agitate Carson so deeply that their appearances led to tense backstage moments, long-held grudges, and in a few cases, permanent exclusion from the show. So who left such an impression that, decades later at age 79, Johnny still remembered their names? Let's look at the 8 famous figures who rattled the king of late night and the infamous moments that made the list. Number 8, Frank Sinatra. Carson was always the epitome of calm, steady in front of millions, always armed with a clever retort. But then there was Frank Sinatra. Whenever Sinatra entered the building, even Carson's legendary composure wavered. Sinatra never simply arrived. He made an entrance. His team descended first, tinkering with the studio climate, setting up teleprompters, and arranging seats for his dozen-person entourage along the side of the set. NBC's security didn't just jot down his arrival, they announced it in huge block letters, preparing as if for royalty. Carson, who thrived on order, knew this was a different show. Sinatra ran by his own schedule. If he didn't like a detail, a staffer's pronunciation, a misplaced spotlight, he'd make his displeasure known, sometimes having a junior producer quietly removed for a slip. Johnny, ever gracious for the cameras, would let it roll off his back. But those nights his staff saw him pour himself an extra scotch, muttering half under his breath, "Chairman of the board, sure, but I still sign the network paychecks." Perhaps the most legendary moment came in 1976. Carson was midway through his monologue, cracking a peanut allergy joke, when Sinatra wandered on stage, draping an arm around Johnny for the world to see. The audience roared, giving Frank a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Carson, not missing a beat, asked, "Do you need the whole show, Frank?" Sinatra grinned and replied, "Only until the band packed up." Electrifying for viewers, exasperating for Carson. To the millions watching, it was charming spontaneity. For Johnny, it was a territorial line crossed. The monologue was Carson's domain, his sacred moment to set the tone. Sinatra walked in and took it, no warning needed. And Carson knew it wouldn't be the last time. Still, he never let the tension reach the broadcast. He'd introduce Frank with the utmost respect, guide the conversation into nostalgia about Rat Pack nights or famous old performances, steering away from anything explosive, mob stories, political brawls, or marital scandal. The show's ratings soared, but so did Johnny's stress level. Carson understood what Sinatra brought: buzz, gravitas, excitement. There was no question that Frank's presence was a huge draw, and Johnny was too much a professional to let personal annoyance spoil the show. But behind the curtain, he felt the weight of a silent battle, his urge to respect a legend and his duty to keep The Tonight Show his own. Even as the emperor of late night, there were times Carson had to yield, if only briefly, to Sinatra's extraordinary force. He always managed it with dignity and a quip, knowing not every icon would play by his rules. Surprised to see Frank on the list? Wait until you hear about the next name. Number 7, Chevy Chase. Carson possessed a rare talent for making guests feel comfortable, blending humor and authority to keep the show on track. Most visitors fit seamlessly into the Tonight Show rhythm, but Chevy Chase broke the mold. While the country saw Chase as a meteoric comedy star in the 1970s, fresh off Saturday Night Live, Carson saw something colder lurking behind the sly comments and smirks. It wasn't just about Chase's fame. Carson had handled plenty of big egos before. What made Chevy difficult was the way he carried himself. His humor was sharp, often delivered in a deadpan way that lacked the friendliness Johnny valued. Viewers hoped for playful exchanges and banter. Instead, the mood often turned chilly, with jokes landing a little too close to mean-spirited. Carson, a master at letting guests shine while keeping the laughs rolling, found himself wrestling for control when Chase was in the chair. He was used to witty repartee, But Chevy's style made every segment feel like a battle for the spotlight. His confidence, even arrogance, projected a clear message. He wasn't just another guest. He was the headliner. NBC staff whispered that Carson saw him not just as a handful, but as a potential successor, a threat to his own legacy. As a trailblazer at SNL, Chase's ambition was no secret, and for a time, some thought he might inherit late night's crown. That possibility didn't sit well with Johnny, who'd spent years turning The Tonight Show into a television institution. He had no patience for anyone treating his platform as a stepping stone. Publicly, Carson never spoke out against Chase, but insiders noticed the lack of rapport. Missing was the sparkle that characterized Johnny's best interviews. When the cameras went dark, the distance was even clearer. In the world of live TV, timing and mutual respect are everything. Chevy simply threw that balance off, and for Johnny Carson, some guests simply weren't worth the trouble. But if Chevy's cockiness was hard for Carson to manage, the next guest made things even trickier, not with ego, but with a kind of stillness that brought the show to a grinding halt. Number 6, Fred Rogers. If Chevy Chase tested Johnny's patience, Fred Rogers left him completely out of sync. Where Chase brought swagger, Rogers offered humility, and somehow that unsettled Johnny even more. It sounded like the perfect pairing on paper. Late night's sharpest mind meeting television's gentlest soul. Producers imagined a quick 5-minute segment with puppets and wholesome talk. Just a pleasant breather from the parade of celebrities. Instead, from the moment Rogers entered the lights, the energy in the studio shifted. He didn't rush in or play to the crowd. He walked calmly to center stage, pausing to give a soft, "Thank you very much, friends. I'm very glad to be here." The audience applauded, unsure whether to stop. Backstage, the crew scrambled to cue up the applause. No one wanted to leave him hanging, but the awkward pause lingered. The invisible clock that ran Carson's show seemed to falter. Johnny, ever the improviser, tried to break the ice by flashing his foot. He had slipped on white sneakers in honor of his guest. "Fred, I wore these in your honor," he announced with a grin. Rogers just smiled, folded his hands, and replied, "That's very thoughtful, Johnny. Sneakers can help us feel ready to play." The crowd tittered, waiting for a punchline, but none came. Rogers was sincere. No setup, no joke, just earnestness. In the world of late-night laughs, the moment was like hitting the brakes. Johnny pivoted, asking for a funny story or a crazy piece of fan mail, but Rogers offered only a gentle story about a child and the power of imagination. No laughs, just a soothing calm. Each word was spaced like a lullaby, perfect for preschoolers but a challenge for a midnight audience. Behind the scenes, panic grew. Writers scratched entire jokes from the lineup. Directors cut to wider shots, hoping to fill the quiet. Johnny nodded along, but sweat beaded under his collar. No one made fun of Mr. Rogers. He was simply too beloved. But Johnny found himself unable to spark the usual back and forth. The energy was gone, the rhythm lost. Viewers at home saw warmth. Stagehands backstage saw crisis. When the segment finally ended, Johnny exhaled so hard he nearly fogged the desk glass. The crew called it a pacing nightmare. Ratings dipped. The laugh tracker showed less than half the usual chuckles. But then, the next day, a flood of letters arrived. Parents, many who never stayed up late, thanking the show for letting Mr. Rogers have his moment. As producer Fred de Cordova put it, "We gained goodwill, just not momentum." From then on, Rogers was booked during the softer December season, and the writing team trimmed monologues to give the segment more breathing room. Johnny was always polite, shaking Fred's hand and thanking him, but once, after a particularly tranquil episode, he leaned to a stage manager and whispered, "Book him after a stand-up next time." Not before. Daddy needs caffeine after that. Years later, asked which guest was most challenging, not worst, just toughest, Johnny supposedly smiled and said, "Fred Rogers, wonderful man, but it's the only interview where I kept checking the clock and my pulse at the same time." If Chevy had overwhelmed Carson with ego, Fred had completely disarmed him with stillness. In that silence, two legends, each a master in his own way, found themselves out of step, and television got an awkward but unforgettable moment. Number 5. Bob Hope. For decades, Bob Hope was considered NBC's most treasured asset. He was the gold standard, beloved by executives and sponsors alike. Whenever Hope came to The Tonight Show, he never came empty-handed. Instead, he arrived armed with a thick binder of jokes, conversation starters, and carefully plotted product plugs. In fact, his team would mail thick packets of pre-approved material down to the last camera angle, days before the taping. For Johnny Carson, a host who thrived on unscripted banter and spontaneous moments, this felt like getting a sheet of music at a jazz club. During interviews, Hope rarely even looked at Johnny. His eyes locked on cue cards propped near the cameras, waiting for Carson to lob him a setup so he could smash home a canned punchline. Whenever Carson tried to detour, tossing in a question that wasn't on the script, Hope simply blinked, shuffled his cards, and delivered the pre-written gag anyway. The laughter that followed sounded polite, but Carson's frustration showed in the way his pencil tapped on the desk. The most aggravating moments came when Hope shifted into promotional mode. He didn't offer personal stories or fresh memories. Every segment turned into a commercial. During one 1978 appearance, he managed to mention Texaco 3 times in under 10 minutes. Carson joked, "Texaco gets more airtime than I do." The laugh was real, but so was the exhaustion. Staff remembered him muttering backstage, "I'm the warm-up act for a corporate sponsorship." To make matters worse, Bob Hope wasn't a guest who could simply be dropped from the lineup. He was a permanent fixture. Even if he had nothing new to say, network brass insisted on bringing him back. After all, he drew older viewers, and his TV specials generated millions for NBC. Carson tried to argue for fresher faces, but executives reminded him who was paying the bills. Johnny gave in, but put his own spin on things. Hope's segments were now followed by energetic musical guests or unpredictable comedians to try to revive the natural flow of the show. Yet every time Bob walked into the studio, staff would joke that the temperature in Johnny's dressing room dropped 10 degrees. It wasn't fear, it was resignation. There was never an open feud. Carson smiled, Hope grinned, the show went on, and the network cashed in. But for anyone watching closely, Johnny's famous composure sometimes slipped, revealing a host just waiting for the segment to end. Despite his legend status, Bob Hope's visits became an obligation, not a joy. For a master of improvisation, nothing was more grating than being locked into a routine that wasn't his own. Number 4. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston didn't just stroll onto The Tonight Show. He entered with the gravity of a senator testifying before Congress. His commanding presence, famous roles as Moses in Ben-Hur, and booming voice all contributed to an air of self-importance that filled the studio. For Johnny, who built his career on breezy banter and rapid-fire wit, hosting Heston was less an interview and more a symposium. A typical exchange might go something like this. Johnny asks, "Ever get hurt filming those wild chariot scenes, Chuck?" Instead of a quick answer, Heston would launch into a journey through his childhood horseback riding, his Yale drama years, the philosophy of acting, and the nobility of risk. Finally arriving, minutes later, at the actual anecdote. Meanwhile, the studio band fidgeted, and Carson's patience wore thin behind his polite nods. Even during commercials, Heston couldn't switch off. He would clarify his on-air points, offer extra historical references, quote ancient writers, and once even suggested Johnny visit the NRA Museum. The audience sometimes seemed confused. Were they watching a talk show or attending a college lecture? After a 1987 episode, producers counted just 9 laugh breaks, a sharp drop from the usual 30. To bring the energy back, Carson's team once brought in Don Rickles to follow Heston. Rickles looked at the serious crowd and cracked, "Who died?" The studio erupted. Backstage, Johnny thanked Rickles and whispered, "Always follow Moses with mayhem." Still, Heston was never banned. He was simply managed. Producers kept his segments to a strict 8 minutes, allowed only one epic story, and discouraged long political tangents. The goal was to keep things lively, even if it meant cutting off a legend. Carson didn't dislike Heston personally. He admired his cinematic legacy. But on air, their chemistry was off. Johnny thrived on fluid, unscripted moments, while Heston brought the gravity of a courtroom summation. His interest was not in jokes, but in pronouncements, and his presence commanded attention rather than laughter. Adding to the challenge was Heston's outspoken politics. By the late 80s, he was known for his alignment with the NRA and vocal conservatism, which made him a lightning rod in an industry that leaned left. Carson preferred to poke fun at both sides without getting dragged into controversy. If Heston bristled at a joke, Johnny wisely moved on. Some laughs simply weren't worth the trouble. In the end, Heston belonged on the big screen, where drama reigned. Carson belonged on the late-night stage, where wit ruled. The two rarely blended comfortably. Number 3. Wayne Newton. Not every confrontation was polite or philosophical. Some were raw, direct, and left a lasting mark on Carson's memory. For several years in the late 70s and early 80s, Johnny peppered his monologues with jokes about Wayne Newton, teasing his lush hair, Vegas act, and flamboyant image. Audiences loved it, but Newton most certainly did not. Unlike other stars who shrugged off the ribbing, Newton simmered. At the time, he was more than a lounge singer. He was Las Vegas royalty, having just poured millions into buying the Aladdin Hotel. Every jab at his image felt not just personal, but expensive. Behind the glitz, rumors spread. Newton was angry. Then one day in 1980, he decided to act. Without warning, Wayne Newton flew to Burbank, marched into NBC, and strode straight to Johnny's office. Security cameras later showed him walking the halls like a man with a mission. Shirt open, fists clenched, eyes burning cold. Carson was reviewing cue cards when Newton entered. According to longtime stage manager Fred de Cordova, the room went silent. Newton leaned in, voice low and steady, and delivered a single chilling line. "You ever call me a joke again? I'll show you the punchline." He turned and left. Johnny said nothing, didn't move. For nearly a minute, he just sat in silence, then finally breathed out, "Well, damn." That night, every joke about Newton vanished from the script. The monologue found safer targets: politicians, airlines, the weather. Carson's trademark edge was gone, at least when it came to Newton. Insiders noticed the difference. The king of late night, once fearless in his mockery, now tiptoed around a single name. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew some lines were too risky to cross. Newton wasn't just a celebrity, he had influence, deep roots, and a temper that couldn't be laughed away. Afterward, Newton only returned as a guest under tightly controlled circumstances. No jokes before or after, no sly references, just stiff politeness. Where once The Tonight Show was a playground for fun, this feud turned it into a quiet standoff. The tension never erupted in tabloids, but Carson carried that moment with him, a bruise beneath his professional calm. It was one of the rare times the master of punchlines had been left speechless, not by scandal or ratings, but by the sheer force of a guest who refused to be the butt of a joke. Newton reclaimed his dignity in a hallway, with a sentence and a look that could outshine 1,000 laughs. Number 2. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers made her first Tonight Show appearance in 1965, opening with a line that brought down the house. "It's so exciting to be here. My mother finally stopped crying." Carson loved that self-mocking humor. For 2 decades, Joan was more than a recurring guest. She became a fixture. He had her on nearly 100 times and, in a move he'd never made before, named her his regular guest host, a sign of rare trust and friendship. Behind the scenes, Joan never took that relationship for granted. She sent Johnny thank you notes, cakes with "boss" written in icing, and always asked for his approval after each show. But all relationships have limits, and ambition sometimes pushes past them. By 1986, Rivers had sat in for Johnny almost 200 nights, building chemistry with his audience and a late-night persona of her own. She was no longer just a sidekick. She was a real contender. That year, the fledgling Fox network saw their chance. They offered Rivers her own show, with creative control and a salary NBC wouldn't match. She would be the first woman to ever host a major network late-night show. Joan hesitated. Taking the deal meant stepping out of Johnny's shadow, but she agonized over how to tell him. Advisors warned her to keep quiet. The Fox offer might vanish if it leaked. She gambled, relying on a press embargo, hoping to call Carson first. But he found out with the rest of America, watching the news at 6 p.m. To Carson, it felt like a betrayal. When Rivers called, he was heard saying, "I don't want to talk to her," and hung up. The next day, her name disappeared from the Tonight Show booking list. A note was scrawled on the sheet. Joan Rivers was blacklisted. This rift went deeper than any tabloid feud. Carson believed in loyalty. To him, the silence before her announcement was the real wound. From that day on, he never spoke to her again. Rivers' new show debuted with buzz but fizzled quickly. Ratings fell, affiliates dropped out, and behind-the-scenes trouble mounted. As her career struggled and her husband's tragic suicide shook her world, Carson remained unmoved. Even Jay Leno, who succeeded Carson, honored the ban. It wasn't until 2014, when Jimmy Fallon finally invited Rivers back, that the ghost of the feud was finally lifted. For many, that night felt like the end of an era. What started as laughter and mutual respect ended in complete silence, and in all the years that followed, Joan Rivers never got the one thing she wanted from Johnny. Not the spotlight, not applause, but a simple return phone call. Number 1, Don Rickles. Where most comedians eased into their routines, Don Rickles came on like a hurricane. The moment he hit Johnny's stage, he unleashed rapid-fire insults, targeting everyone, including Carson. "Look at you, 30 million people watching a hockey puck," Rickles would deadpan, and the audience would howl. But for Carson, Rickles wasn't just unpredictable, he was almost uncontrollable. Their chemistry was electric, sometimes bordering on combustible. Rickles' brand of comedy often veered dangerously close to the line, and not always with Johnny's blessing. When Rickles guest hosted in 1976, he accidentally broke Carson's treasured wooden cigarette box and left without a word. The next evening, Johnny discovered the damage live on air, stopped the show, and famously marched across the NBC lot to the set of CPO Sharkey, where Rickles was filming. Cameras followed as Johnny confronted him, box in hand. "You broke my box." Rickles, never missing a beat, feigned terror for the crowd. The whole exchange became late-night legend. But beneath the laughter, Johnny understood what Rickles brought: chaos, risk, and ratings. Off-camera, Rickles ignored time cues, steamrolled other guests, and sometimes dove into material that made NBC's censors sweat. After a 1985 appearance where Rickles mocked an audience member's weight, complaints poured in. Johnny, fond as he was of Don, set new boundaries. Family-friendly jokes only, no deeply personal shots, and strict time limits. Rickles, being Rickles, managed to obey just barely. He'd grin, nod, and then step right up to the edge again. Despite the tension, Johnny always invited Rickles back. Their friendship was genuine, battle-tested by years of on-air mayhem. Crew members used to joke that Rickles was like espresso. Once per sweep season was enough to electrify the audience, but more than that could push the show over the edge. Unlike Joan Rivers, whose ambition sometimes left scars, Rickles left behind only a delightful mess. And somehow, Johnny always picked up the pieces with his signature wry smile. So what was it that kept Johnny Carson smiling through chaos, rivalry, and the occasional broken heart? Was it an iron grip on control, or pure survival instinct honed from decades behind the desk? Maybe it was a bit of both. A master performer knowing that no matter who sat across from him, the audience always came first. Let us know what you think. Did Johnny's patience make him the greatest of all time? Which guest story surprised you the most? Share your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the golden age of television.